you're looking into the early 2000s movie roster, there's a high chance you've come across the Underworld franchise. And if you look at the critical review, chances are you'll see it described as sleazy and derivative. But then, if you look into the numbers, you'll see that one movie, which came out in 2003, gave us 5 films, an animated series, $95 million grossed on a budget of $22 million, and a total of $539 million worldwide when you consider the whole franchise. Plus, it also gave us one of the most iconic heroines of her generation, Kate Beckinsale as Selene. Pretty good track record, right? But then, somewhere down the line, between the 4th and 5th film, something broke. The box office numbers slid off a cliff, and the franchise went dark. Then, in early 2026, the face of the franchise, Beckinsale herself, announced that she would never return to the series because the people who own Underworld had engaged in criminal behavior of a very serious nature. And that drew the curtain on all my hopes and dreams of this franchise returning. So of course, I gotta know what happened. And I'm sure if you grew up with the Underworld franchise, you've been wondering about it too. So let's get to it and answer what actually happened for the franchise to end this way. The first film, well, it was born from a very specific creative partnership. We have Kevin Grevioux, Len Wiseman, and Danny McBride working together with Wiseman as the director and Grevioux himself on screen as the massive lichen Rays. See, Grevioux had come up with the original concept by basing the lore on lycanthropy and vampirism in viral science instead of the usual route of folklore. And I gotta say, that worked. I remember how surprised I was when it all made sense. And the premise of the movie was also very simple. You have vampire aristocrats called the Death Dealers, who are hunted by werewolves called lichens in this unnamed European city. Very gothic, very chic, and very entertaining once you have Kate Beckinsale on your screen in a latex bodysuit with 2 pistols. Sure, it's a little campy, but it was committed to it. The movie knew exactly what it was, and we loved it. That's what made the movie so memorable. But all of this almost didn't happen because 2 weeks before the film opened, White Wolf, this publisher of tabletop RPGs, Vampire the Masquerade, and Werewolf the Apocalypse, filed 17 counts of copyright infringement against Sony Pictures, Lakeshore Entertainment, and Screen Gems. In their lawsuit, they claimed over 80 points of similarity between their World of Darkness setting and the Underworld. And to be honest, they weren't wrong. The secret vampire power structures with rotating elders? Check. Lichen servants kept under check? Yes. Gothic punk aesthetic? Check. Even author Nancy A. Collins jumped in on the suit, alleging that the script of the movie was similar to her 1994 White Wolf published story, Love of Monsters. And with this much evidence, the judge granted an expedited hearing. The stakes were high, and the water was up to the neck. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, the case was settled confidentially in a matter of days, and the film opened on schedule. And none of us in that theater had any idea that all of this went down. The critics slammed it when they watched it. The Rotten Tomatoes score is at 31%? But the audience loved it. And why wouldn't they? We finally had a movie that took its own mythology seriously. And also, we loved a strong female character. Selene was truly one of a kind. From the moment she's introduced on screen, she is the most dangerous person in every room, and that was very rare for a female lead in the movies back then. So the whole gaining $95 million on a budget of $22 million was a sign that we were ready for more Selene. Then you have Evolution, which came out in 2006 and made $111 million on a budget of $45 million. It was commercially a bit better, but critically, it was worse than the first movie. Then you have Rise of the Lycas in 2009, which dropped Beckinsale completely and got a $91 million payback on a budget of $35 million. Then we have Awakening in 2012, which was basically the peak in every way possible. It got $160 million worldwide on a budget of $70 million. And at this point, Screen Gems knew they had something that was very consistent. Plus, the trajectory had been smoothly climbing up so far, so what's not to love? But you know what they say, whatever goes up must eventually come down. And that was Blood Wars in 2017. This movie only made $81 million on a budget of $35 million. Now, on paper, that seems pretty profitable, right? But if you look at the domestic numbers, which was only $30 million, it was the lowest out of all the movies. Plus, it received a score of 21% on Rotten Tomatoes. Each film was doing significantly lower in the North American theaters, and there was this vibe that the goodwill of its existing fan base was starting to deplete. Plus, you also have to keep in mind that none of the Underworld films actually became critically beloved. None of them cracked over 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, but the audience was showing up for it. However, by the last movie, there was nothing worth showing up for, if that makes sense. See, in the lore of the franchise, you have this ancient vampire elder system with 3 rulers, Victor, Amelia, and Marcus. They're sleeping in rotating cycles, with only one of them awake at a given time. There's also a lichen-slave history involved, which makes the war between the 2 species feel very grounded. The love interest, Michael Corvin, being the only one to carry the rare Corvinus bloodline, making him the only being capable of merging both species and becoming a hybrid, is also pretty grounded. And from what I've told you, you can tell that there is so much history in this world. That's why Len Wiseman produced this graphic novel, Tales from Year Zero, to map out the history to a degree. With everything in mind, you'd think that there would be no problem for the franchise, right? Yeah, but no. So every single movie introduced us to a new mythology without ever using or resolving the story that came before it. Like by the time Awakening came around, Michael was cut out. That's a huge loss, given he's the emotional engine of the first 2 films. Now, he did show up briefly because of contractual circumstances, but man, with no Michael, the relationship that grounded the whole franchise was gone. Then in Blood Wars, we're introduced to a new villain called Marius, and this Nordic vampire coven, which was never mentioned before. So watching the movie felt like the writers were grasping at straws to keep milking the cash cow. Then you have the director problem. The first 2 films were directed by Wiseman, and you can tell that the same man was working on both because there's a similar tonality, similar cinematography, shots, etc., right? Then Rise of the Lycans was directed by Patrick Tatopoulos, while Awakening was directed by Mans Marland and Bjorn Stein. Blood Wars, on the other hand, was directed by Anna Forster. Now, I'm not saying that these filmmakers were incompetent. I mean, look at Forster. She brought some real craft to the film's visual identity, but because of all the different directors, you can tell everyone had a different interpretation of what the Gothic universe of Underworld should look like. As a result, every film has a different texture, which visually makes them feel disjointed. Like, I know they're all part of the franchise, but damn, none of them feels like a part of the same franchise, you know? And then we come to Beckinsale. She was the star of the franchise. If she were in the movie, the tickets would sell. But Beckinsale's relationship was growing more and more strained over the years with the franchise. The role had a lot of physical demands, which Beckinsale was willing to meet, but it was taking a toll on her. Plus, no one was actually listening to her contributions, and she could feel that the institutional indifference was setting in for this franchise. And then, in early 2026, in an interview, she made it public. She was asked on Instagram if she would return to Underworld, and she said, quote, "Unfortunately, that will not be possible due to the fact that the people that own Underworld are not people that I would be able to work with due to criminal behavior of a very serious nature and general bad behavior. However, I very much appreciate the opportunity I had, but that is not something I will be able to continue in the future for those reasons." Say what you want, but this message doesn't sound like an "I have moved on" message. It sounds more like "I am done and I'm never returning." And she also offered no specifics as to why she said what she said. And if you look into the past, you'll see that in 2024, Beckinsale actually filed a lawsuit. At first, she filed it under a pseudonym, but it was later revealed to be hers. And who did she sue? The producers of her film Canary Black, alleging that she was forced to perform dangerous stunts against medical advice following a very complex meniscus tear. Despite many recommendations from her orthopedic surgeon, Beckinsale's production team refused to listen to her. Now, I know that Canary Black and the Underworld statement are 2 very different situations, 2 companies and all, but together you can tell that this is an actress who has been dealing with genuinely serious institutional failures in her professional life and was forced into a dangerous situation. So of course, at this point, she's reached a point of complete zero tolerance. But while the actress has been going through so much, Len Wiseman has been having a whole different experience. Back in October 2014, he announced that the Underworld TV series was in development. In January 2016, he confirmed that it was being developed for sure, but no timeline was given. Then in September 2017, Deadline reported that the series had officially entered formal development as a joint venture between Lakeshore Entertainment, Sketch Films, Screen Gems, and Sony Pictures Television. Wiseman was a part of this venture as executive producer. He even went on record that he wanted the TV show to have a darker and more grounded tone. Then, 7 years go by, with barely any updates. In September 2023, when he was asked if there were any plans to bring Underworld back, he told Entertainment Weekly, "There is a fashion that is in the works. I can't talk about it, but there is a future to Underworld for sure." But he didn't give any more details. Then we come to May of 2025. At the press for Ballerina from the world of John Wick, Wiseman told Comic Book that "We're doing a TV series and it's awesome," but he refused to give us any name of the platform or the premiere date. So now in 2026, all we have is a franchise that's in a state of permanent pre-production, one of the worst institutional limbos to be in. That's what hurts me the most when it comes to the Underworld franchise. This franchise was alive and well, even if the critics slammed it fully. The audience kept showing up through franchise fatigue because the characters were beloved. The lore was deep, the visual identity was unique, and it was genuinely a good movie. But now, here we are. 9 years later, the woman who was the face of the franchise cannot return to the franchise because of the criminal conduct of the people who own it. The TV series that has been promised to us since God knows when is still in production with no serious date in sight. No cast, no creative team, and no screenwriter, or at least none have been made officially known. Selene and Michael's story, which drew most of the fans, including me, will remain unfinished because we don't know how their lives end. The Underworld franchise ended because the people running the show never truly understood what made Underworld so popular in the first place, and kept trying to experiment and do new things. You know what they say, right? You never know what you have until it's gone. Well, that's the Underworld franchise for us. So, please like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments what your fanfiction ending for Selene and Michael is, because I swear to God, I made up my own closing scene for the franchise too. Also, would you guys even show up for an Underworld reboot if Kate Beckinsale isn't in it? Because I don't know if I would.